They mocked his old truck, pointing and laughing, until the engine roared to life and revealed a secret built for war. In seconds, their laughter turned to silence and fear. I stood in my driveway, watching Marcus Henderson, our HOA president, taking photographs of my military spec truck while 3 other board members nodded approvingly behind him. The morning sun glinted off the reinforced steel panels and custom armor plating that most people mistook for rust and dents. Marcus held up his phone, recording a video as he circled my vehicle like a vulture. "This eyesore has been plaguing our pristine Willowbrook estates for far too long," he announced to his camera, his voice dripping with authority. "Today, we're documenting every violation this piece of junk represents." His companions, Robert Shunn, the treasurer, David Martinez, the secretary, and James Wilson, the compliance officer, all chuckled as Marcus pointed out what he called deteriorating paint, structural damage, and mechanical hazards. What they didn't know was that every flaw they were mocking had been deliberately engineered by military contractors for desert combat operations. The truck had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, survived IED blasts, and had been custom modified with features that would make their luxury SUVs look like children's toys. As Marcus finished his documentation, he turned to me with that smug smile I'd grown to despise. "Mr. Thompson, you have 48 hours to remove this abomination from our community, or we'll have it towed at your expense." I nodded calmly, my hands clasped behind my back, watching as the 4 men strutted away like peacocks. They had no idea that their perfectly manicured world was about to be turned upside down. You see, Marcus Henderson thought he knew everything about power and control, but he was about to learn that some battles are won before they're even fought. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they could push everyone around? Let me know in the comments, because this story is just getting started. Marcus Henderson wasn't just your average HOA president. He was a man possessed by the intoxicating drug of neighborhood authority. Standing at 6 feet tall, with perfectly styled silver hair and a wardrobe that screamed, "I have arrived," Marcus ruled Willowbrook Estates like his personal kingdom. He'd moved into the community 5 years ago after selling his tech startup for millions, and within 6 months, he'd maneuvered himself into the HOA presidency through a combination of charm, intimidation, and strategic alliances. His first act was to implement what he called the Willowbrook Standard, a comprehensive set of rules that governed everything from mailbox colors to the exact species of flowers allowed in front yards. Marcus thrived on the power trips, the way neighbors would nervously approach him at community meetings, and especially the fear in people's eyes when he threatened fines or legal action. His board members, Robert, David, and James, were carefully chosen yes-men who rarely questioned his decisions and always backed his increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. Robert Shunn, a retired accountant, handled the financials with ruthless efficiency, always finding ways to justify hefty fines and special assessments. David Martinez, a former insurance adjuster, specialized in finding violations where none existed, armed with a measuring tape and an encyclopedia knowledge of obscure HOA regulations. James Wilson, who'd worked in code enforcement for the city, brought a governmental authority to their operations that made residents feel like they were dealing with actual law enforcement. Together, they formed what residents secretly called the 4 Horsemen of Willowbrook, riding through the neighborhood on their golf cart patrols, clipboards in hand, ready to write citations for grass that was a 1/4 inch too tall or Christmas decorations left up 3 days past the arbitrary deadline. Marcus particularly enjoyed targeting residents he perceived as beneath the community standard, elderly homeowners on fixed incomes, young families struggling with mortgages, and anyone who dared to question his authority. But his favorite target had become me, Jake Thompson, the quiet veteran who lived at the end of Maple Street with what Marcus called that mechanical monstrosity parked in my driveway. Little did Marcus know that his obsession with my truck was about to become the biggest mistake of his perfectly planned life. The harassment had been building for months, but Marcus's fatal error came on a Tuesday morning in late September when he decided to take matters into his own hands. I was inside having coffee when I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal from my driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Marcus and James Wilson attempting to attach a boot clamp to my truck's front wheel while Robert filmed the entire operation on his phone. What they didn't realize was that my truck's security system, a military-grade installation that I'd never bothered to mention, was recording everything in high-definition video and automatically uploading it to secure cloud storage. As I watched from inside, Marcus struggled with the boot clamp, clearly frustrated that it wouldn't fit properly around the specially designed wheel assembly. "This thing is built like a tank," I heard James mutter, not realizing how literally accurate his observation was. Marcus, red-faced and sweating despite the cool morning air, finally managed to attach the device, then stood back to admire his handiwork. But his masterpiece of intimidation was just the beginning of his spectacular miscalculation. Later that afternoon, while I was at my job at the Veterans Administration office, Marcus took his harassment to a new level. He called the county code enforcement, claiming my truck was leaking hazardous fluids and posed an environmental threat to the neighborhood. He then contacted 3 different towing companies, telling each one that he had legal authority to have the vehicle removed from private property. When those efforts failed because the truck was legally registered and properly insured, Marcus made his biggest mistake of all. He contacted his brother-in-law, Trevor, who worked for a local utility company, and convinced him to accidentally cut the power line to my house during routine maintenance. The plan was simple: make my life miserable enough that I'd cave to his demands and get rid of the truck. What Marcus didn't know was that my house ran on a hybrid system, with a backup generator that could power the entire property for weeks, and that cutting someone's utilities as retaliation was a federal crime when done deliberately. As I returned home that evening to find my street mysteriously dark except for my house, which was glowing like a beacon thanks to the backup power system, I realized that Marcus Henderson had just handed me everything I needed to destroy him completely. What Marcus didn't know about me could fill a book, but the most important detail was my 20-year career as a military intelligence analyst before transitioning to my current role investigating fraud at the VA. Every threatening letter, every bogus fine, every intimidation tactic had been carefully documented, photographed, and stored in multiple secure locations. My truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile surveillance platform equipped with cameras, audio recording equipment, and satellite communication systems that I'd legally purchased from military surplus auctions. While Marcus thought he was dealing with just another pushover homeowner, he was actually waging war against someone who'd spent 2 decades learning how to gather intelligence, build cases, and take down much more dangerous adversaries than a suburban HOA president. My home office looked like something out of a spy thriller, with multiple monitors displaying security feeds, legal databases, and financial tracking software. I'd been quietly investigating Marcus and his board for months, following paper trails, analyzing their voting patterns, and documenting their increasingly illegal activities. The evidence was staggering. Marcus had been systematically embezzling HOA funds through a shell company he'd created, using his brother-in-law's utility connections to harass residents, and falsifying legal documents to justify his enforcement actions. Robert Chun had been cooking the books, hiding the financial irregularities behind complex accounting maneuvers that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. David Martinez had been filing false reports with the county, claiming code violations that didn't exist and pocketing the consultation fees he charged residents to help them comply with regulations he'd made up. James Wilson had been using his former government connections to access restricted databases, gathering personal information on residents to use as leverage in HOA disputes. But the most damning evidence was something Marcus had no idea I possessed: complete financial records showing how the 4 men had been systematically targeting elderly and veteran residents, knowing these groups were less likely to fight back against their increasingly outrageous demands. They'd forced 12 families to sell their homes over the past 2 years through harassment and fabricated violations that ensured those properties were sold to Marcus's real estate investment company at below-market prices. As I compiled the evidence into a comprehensive case file, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Marcus thought my truck was an eyesore that didn't belong in his perfect community, But he had no idea that the same military training that had taught me to survive in combat zones had also taught me exactly how to dismantle his little empire of corruption, one carefully documented crime at a time. The monthly HOA meeting on October 15th was standing room only, with nearly every homeowner in. Willowbrook Estates packed into the community center. Marcus had called the special session to address what he termed ongoing compliance issues and community standards. But what he didn't know was that I'd been quietly reaching out to every resident he'd targeted over the years. The meeting started typically, with Marcus standing at the podium in his expensive suit, radiating the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He began with his usual presentation about property values and community standards, clicking through a slideshow of alleged violations that included several photos of my truck. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with theatrical flair, "we cannot allow individual selfishness to destroy everything we've built together." The crowd murmured agreement, many of them still unaware of the criminal enterprise operating under the guise of community management. That's when I stood up from the back of the room, holding a thick manila folder and a laptop computer. "Mr. Henderson," I called out, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned in briefing rooms and command centers. "Before we discuss community standards, perhaps we should discuss community crimes." The room fell silent as I walked to the front, connecting my laptop to the projection system that Marcus had been using for his presentation. The first image that appeared on the screen was a bank statement showing $127,000 in unexplained transfers from the HOA account to Henderson Property Solutions, LLC, Marcus's shell company. "This is interesting financial management for a community organization," I said calmly, advancing to the next slide. The room erupted in shocked whispers as residents saw their HOA fees being systematically stolen. Marcus's confident expression began to crack as I displayed document after document. Forged inspection reports, falsified legal citations, and recorded phone conversations where he bragged about forcing undesirable residents to sell their homes. Robert Chun tried to interrupt, claiming the documents were fake, but I was ready for that objection. The next slide showed bank security footage of Robert depositing HOA checks into personal accounts, time-stamped and crystal clear. David Martinez attempted to leave through the back door, but several residents blocked his path as I displayed the county records showing his fake violation reports. James Wilson sat frozen in his chair as I revealed how he'd been using government databases to conduct illegal background checks on neighbors. The final revelation was the recorded conversation between Marcus and his brother-in-law Trevor, discussing the plan to cut power to my house as retaliation for refusing to remove my truck. As the recording played through the room speakers, Marcus's voice clearly stating, "Make his life miserable until he caves," the crowd's shock turned to outrage. Marcus tried desperately to regain control, shouting about privacy violations and illegal recordings. But his protests were drowned out by the angry voices of residents who were finally understanding how they'd been manipulated and robbed. When I announced that I'd already forwarded everything to the FBI, the county prosecutor, and the state attorney general's office, Marcus Henderson, the man who'd spent 5 years terrorizing his neighbors, finally realized that his perfectly constructed world of power and corruption was crashing down around him. The FBI arrived at Marcus Henderson's house at 6:47 a.m. on a cold November morning, just 3 weeks after the explosive HOA meeting that had changed everything. I watched from my kitchen window as federal agents in windbreakers escorted Marcus out of his $1 million home in handcuffs, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, his usual arrogant expression replaced by the hollow stare of a man whose world had completely collapsed. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, identity theft, and violation of federal civil rights laws. The investigation had moved with lightning speed because the evidence I'd provided was so comprehensive that prosecutors called it the most well-documented HOA fraud case in state history. Marcus's attempts to claim ignorance or blame his co-conspirators fell apart when investigators found his personal computer filled with detailed plans for their various schemes, including spreadsheets tracking which residents were most vulnerable to their harassment tactics. Robert Chun was arrested at a CPA office while shredding documents. But the paper destruction came too late. I'd already provided investigators with copies of every financial record from the past 5 years. His professional license was immediately suspended, and the IRS began auditing every tax return he'd prepared for the past decade. David Martinez tried to flee to Mexico, but was arrested at the airport with a suitcase full of cash that he'd withdrawn from various accounts linked to the HOA fraud. His former employer, the insurance company, began reviewing every claim he'd ever processed, discovering a pattern of fraudulent adjustments that added years to his potential sentence. James Wilson's law enforcement connections, which he'd used to intimidate residents, became his greatest liability when former colleagues testified about his requests for illegal database searches and his attempts to use government resources for personal vendettas. The county sheriff, furious that Wilson had dishonored his badge, personally delivered the arrest warrant. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus's real estate empire began crumbling. Every property sale that had been connected to HOA harassment was flagged for investigation, and 12 families filed civil lawsuits seeking damages for the homes they'd been forced to sell under duress. The bank foreclosed on Marcus's house when investigators froze his assets, and his wife filed for divorce, taking their children and moving back to her hometown in Ohio. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "HOA President's Reign of Terror Ends in Federal Prison," complete with photos of Marcus in his orange jumpsuit. Social media exploded with stories from former residents sharing their experiences with Marcus's harassment, and a hashtag Willowbrook corruption trended locally for weeks. The ultimate irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd spent years claiming my military truck was an eyesore that didn't belong in the community was now wearing prison stripes and learning that he was the one who truly didn't belong in civilized society. As the dust settled for Marcus's arrest and the HOA scandal dominated local news, curious neighbors finally learned the truth about the vehicle that had sparked the entire conflict. What Marcus and his cronies had dismissed as a rust bucket and mechanical monstrosity was actually a custom-built MATV, mine-resistant ambush-protected all-terrain vehicle that had been specially modified for civilian use after completing multiple combat deployments. The truck had rolled off the production line at Oshkosh Defense with a price tag of $525,000, making it worth more than most of the luxury vehicles parked in Willowbrook Estates driveways. Every dent and rust spot that Marcus had photographed as evidence of deterioration was actually battle damage from roadside bombs, mortar attacks, and small arms fire, scars that told the story of American soldiers who'd made it home safely because of this. Vehicles protection. The reinforced steel plating that David Martinez had called structural damage was actually level B7 armoring capable of stopping .50 caliber rounds and explosive fragments. The deteriorating paint that Robert Chun had cited in violation notices was a specialized coating designed to reduce the vehicle's thermal signature and protect against chemical attacks. When a local news crew interviewed me about the truck's history, I opened the hood to reveal an engine bay that looked like something from a science fiction movie, a 370 horsepower Caterpillar diesel engine connected to advanced filtration systems, redundant cooling mechanisms, and electronics packages that could operate in the harshest environments on Earth. The interior, which none of the HOA board members had ever seen, featured military-grade communication equipment, blast-resistant seating, and emergency medical supplies that had saved countless lives in combat zones. The truck's most impressive feature was its independent suspension system, designed to keep moving even after losing multiple wheels to explosive devices, a capability that I demonstrated by driving it over a curb that would have disabled any normal civilian vehicle. As word spread about the truck's true nature, my neighbors' attitudes shifted dramatically. Veterans from around the county began stopping by to see the vehicle and share their own military experiences, turning my driveway into an impromptu memorial and gathering place for those who understood the truck's real significance. The local American Legion Post asked if they could feature the truck in their Veterans Day parade, and a military museum inquired about borrowing it for their upcoming exhibit on modern warfare. Children who'd been taught by their parents to view the truck as an eyesore now stared in awe at the vehicle that had protected American soldiers, and many asked if they could sit in the driver's seat and pretend to be heroes. The greatest vindication came when a retired Army colonel who lived 3 streets over approached me with tears in his eyes, explaining that he'd commanded the unit that had used vehicles identical to mine during the Battle of Fallujah, and that seeing my truck brought back memories of the soldiers who'd made it home because of vehicles just like it. In the weeks following Marcus's arrest, Willowbrook Estates underwent a transformation that nobody could have predicted. The community that had once whispered nervously about HOA violations and cowered before Marcus's intimidation tactics suddenly found its collective voice, and that voice was angry. Emergency meetings were held in living rooms and backyards as residents shared stories they'd kept hidden for years. Elderly homeowners who'd been fined thousands of dollars for trivial violations, young families who'd been threatened with foreclosure over minor landscaping issues, and military veterans who'd been targeted specifically because Marcus assumed they wouldn't fight back. Thomas Wright, a retired Navy SEAL who lived on Oak Street, became the unofficial leader of what residents started calling the Willowbrook Resistance. He'd been planning to sell his house after Marcus's harassment over his flagpole had become intolerable, but now he was organizing a complete overhaul of the community's governance structure. Dr. Michael Stevens, a local physician who'd been secretly documenting Marcus's medical privacy violations, came forward with evidence that the former HOA president had been accessing residents' medical records through illegal database searches. Sarah Peterson's husband, Mark, revealed that he'd been pressured to vote for Marcus's preferred candidates in HOA elections after the board discovered his previous bankruptcy and threatened to make the information public. The most powerful moment came when elderly resident Frank Morrison, a World War II veteran, stood up at a community meeting with his walker and declared, "I didn't fight fascists in Europe just to have one running my neighborhood HOA." His words became a rallying cry that spread throughout the community and eventually to social media, where hashtag Willowbrook Resistance began trending nationally. Local businesses that had been intimidated into paying special community partner fees to Marcus's shell companies came forward with their own stories of extortion and illegal business practices. The community pool contractor revealed that he'd been forced to pay kickbacks to Robertson for maintenance contracts, while the landscaping company admitted they'd been overcharging residents and splitting the profits with David Martinez. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Marcus's criminal enterprise had tentacles reaching throughout the local business community, and prosecutors began preparing additional charges related to racketeering and organized crime. The transformation wasn't just about anger and justice. It was about healing and community building. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years because of HOA-manufactured disputes began talking again, discovering that many of their conflicts had been artificially created by Marcus's divide-and-conquer tactics. Block parties were organized for the first time in the community's history, and residents started helping each other with home repairs and maintenance instead of looking for reasons to file violation reports. The community's new motto, painted on a banner that stretched across the entrance to Willowbrook Estates, read, "United we stand, divided we were conquered, never again." The legal proceedings against Marcus Henderson and his co-conspirators became a media sensation that attracted attention far beyond our small community. Court TV requested permission to broadcast the trial, and legal experts from across the country weighed in on what prosecutors called one of the most comprehensive HOA fraud cases in American history. The federal courthouse was packed every day with residents, reporters, and legal observers who wanted to witness what many saw as a landmark case in homeowner rights. Marcus's defense team, a high-priced legal firm from the state capitol, tried every tactic imaginable to reduce their client's exposure, but the evidence I compiled was so overwhelming that even they privately admitted the case was hopeless. During the trial, prosecutors presented over 400 pieces of evidence, including financial records, recorded conversations, video surveillance, and testimony from 47 different victims of the HOA fraud scheme. The star witness was Trevor Henderson, Marcus's brother-in-law, who had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence on the utility tampering charges. His testimony revealed the full scope of Marcus's criminal thinking, including plans to expand their operation to other HOA communities throughout the region. The prosecution's presentation of my truck as evidence was particularly dramatic. They had the vehicle transported to the courthouse parking lot, where federal investigators demonstrated its military capabilities for the jury while explaining how Marcus's harassment had targeted a combat veteran whose service vehicle was worth more than $500,000. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who claimed my truck was bringing down property values had actually been living next to one of the most expensive and historically significant vehicles in the entire county. When I testified about my military service and the truck's combat history, several jurors were visibly moved, and the courtroom fell silent as I described how vehicles like mine had saved countless American lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. Marcus's lawyers tried to paint me as a vindictive neighbor who'd used military training to conduct an illegal surveillance operation, but their arguments collapsed when the judge ruled that all of my evidence had been gathered legally and that Marcus had no reasonable expectation of privacy for crimes committed in public view. The media coverage extended far beyond the courtroom, with national news outlets picking up the story as an example of HOA corruption and the importance of holding community leaders accountable. Military publications featured articles about my truck and the broader issue of veteran discrimination in civilian communities, while legal journals analyzed the case as a template for prosecuting similar crimes. The most satisfying moment came when Marcus took the stand in his own defense, attempting to portray himself as a misunderstood community leader who'd made minor mistakes in judgment. Under cross-examination, prosecutors systematically dismantled his lies using the evidence I provided, and by the end of his testimony, Marcus Henderson, the man who'd once commanded respect and fear throughout Willowbrook Estates, looked like exactly what he was, a common criminal who'd been caught red-handed. The sentencing hearing for Marcus Henderson and his co-conspirators drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself, with residents packing the federal courthouse to witness the final chapter of their community's nightmare. Judge Patricia Williams, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years of experience in federal crime cases, had clearly been affected by the testimony and evidence presented during the trial. As she prepared to announce the sentences, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing, the tension thick with anticipation of justice finally being served. Marcus Henderson, once the proud ruler of Willowbrook Estates, stood before the judge wearing an ill-fitting public defender's suit, his expensive wardrobe having been sold to pay legal fees and restitution. Judge Williams began with a scathing assessment of his crimes, calling them a systematic betrayal of the trust placed in community leadership and a callous exploitation of the very people he was elected to serve. The sentence was everything residents had hoped for: 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and complete restitution of all stolen funds plus penalties totaling $2.3 million. Robert Chun received 8 years for his role in the financial fraud, along with a lifetime ban from working in any capacity involving other people's money. David Martinez was sentenced to 6 years and ordered to pay $180,000 in damages to families who'd been forced to sell their homes based on his fabricated violation reports. James Wilson received 5 years and was permanently barred from any employment requiring a security clearance or background check authority. But the criminal sentences were only the beginning of their punishment. The civil lawsuits filed by affected residents resulted in additional damages that collectively bankrupted all 4 men and their families. Marcus's wife had divorced him before the trial ended, taking their children and half of his remaining assets, while his brother-in-law Trevor lost his job with a utility company and faced his own criminal charges for the power line sabotage. The financial reckoning extended beyond the defendants to include every business and individual who'd profited from their criminal schemes. The community pool contractor was forced to refund 3 years of inflated maintenance fees, while the landscaping company's owners faced their own fraud charges for their role in the kickback scheme. Marcus's real estate investment company was dissolved, with all properties sold at auction to pay restitution to the families who'd been illegally forced from their homes. The most satisfying aspect of the financial justice was watching Marcus's million-dollar mansion being sold to pay his victims. The house that had served as the headquarters for his reign of terror was purchased by a young military couple with 3 children, who immediately installed a flagpole in the front yard and parked their own military surplus vehicle in the driveway. The new owners held an open house party for the entire neighborhood, serving barbecue in the same backyard where Marcus had once held secretive HOA board meetings to plan his next harassment campaigns. As I stood in that transformed space, surrounded by neighbors who were finally free to live without fear of petty tyranny, I realized that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration, healing, and the triumph of community over corruption. With Marcus Henderson and his board of corruption behind bars, Willowbrook Estates faced the challenge of rebuilding its governance structure from the ground up. The community held its first truly democratic elections in over 5 years, with voter turnout reaching an unprecedented 94% as residents who'd been intimidated into silence finally had their voices heard. Thomas Wright, the retired Navy SEAL who'd emerged as a natural leader during the crisis, was elected as the new HOA president on a platform of transparency, accountability, and community service rather than community control. The new board implemented what they called the Willowbrook Charter of Rights, a comprehensive document that guaranteed every resident's right to peaceful enjoyment of their property, due process in all HOA matters, and protection from harassment or discrimination. The charter included specific protections for military veterans, elderly residents, and families with children, the groups that Marcus had most frequently targeted. All HOA meetings were now recorded and streamed live online, with full financial records published quarterly and available for inspection by any resident at any time. The community established an independent oversight committee, chaired by Dr. Michael Stevens, that had the authority to investigate any complaints about board conduct and recommend corrective action. Perhaps most importantly, the new leadership eliminated 80% of the petty rules and regulations that Marcus had used as weapons against his neighbors, focusing instead on genuine community improvements like better street lighting, playground equipment, and landscaping that actually enhance property values rather than generating fine revenue. The transformation wasn't just structural, it was cultural. The monthly HOA meetings, once dreaded encounters with bureaucratic intimidation, became genuine community gatherings where neighbors discussed shared concerns and celebrated achievements. The community newsletter, previously filled with violation warnings and threats, now featured resident spotlights, local business recommendations, and announcements about volunteer opportunities and social events. The pool area, which had been Marcus's personal surveillance post where he'd spy on residents looking for dress code violations, was converted into a family-friendly recreation center with new equipment and extended hours. The community center, formerly used primarily for Marcus's kangaroo court proceedings, became a hub for activities like book clubs, exercise classes, and children's programs. The new board even established a Community Heroes program that recognized residents who'd served their country, contributed to local charities, or helped neighbors in need, a direct reversal of Marcus's policy of targeting and harassing anyone who stood out from his narrow definition of conformity. Thomas Wright's first major initiative was to commission a memorial plaque honoring all military veterans in the community, installed in the spot where Marcus had once posted his most threatening HOA violation notices. The ceremony unveiling the memorial drew veterans from across the county, and my military truck served as the centerpiece of a display honoring all branches of service and all eras of American military history. In the months following the legal victory and HOA transformation, something beautiful began happening in Willowbrook Estates that nobody had expected. Genuine friendships started forming between neighbors who'd been pitted against each other for years by Marcus's divide-and-conquer tactics. The healing process began with small gestures, like elderly residents bringing cookies to families with young children and veterans connecting with each other over shared experiences and mutual support. My truck, once the symbol of everything Marcus claimed was wrong with the community, became a gathering point for impromptu social events and educational opportunities. Every weekend, children would ask their parents if they could visit Mr. Jake's Army truck, and I found myself giving informal tours that turned into history lessons about military service, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting freedom both abroad and at home. Frank Morrison, The World War II veteran who'd become a community hero with his fascist comment started a weekly coffee gathering in my garage where veterans from different eras could share stories and support each other. These sessions grew into a formal veteran support group that attracted participants from throughout the region and eventually received recognition from the State Veterans Affairs Department. The community's children, many of whom had been taught to fear HOA enforcement and keep quiet about their family struggles, began playing freely in the streets again, their laughter replacing the tense whispers that had characterized the neighborhood during Marcus's reign. Parents organized block parties, potluck dinners, and holiday celebrations that brought everyone together regardless of their property values, political affiliations, or personal circumstances. Dr. Stevens started a community garden in the space that had once held Marcus's private putting green, and residents began growing vegetables together while sharing recipes, gardening tips, and stories about their families and backgrounds. The garden became a symbol of how the community had transformed from a place of artificial competition and surveillance into a genuine neighborhood where people cared about each other's well-being. The most unexpected friendship developed between myself and Marcus's former neighbor, Richard Palmer, who confessed that he'd been terrified of my truck because Marcus had convinced him it was dangerous and would explode. When Richard finally accepted my invitation to see the vehicle up close, he was amazed by its engineering and history, and we discovered a shared interest in mechanical restoration projects. Together, we started a weekend workshop in my garage where neighbors could learn basic automotive maintenance, home repair skills, and craftsmanship techniques that brought people together around practical knowledge and mutual assistance. The workshops grew into a community resource where residents shared tools, expertise, and labor for home improvement projects, creating connections that extended far beyond the immediate neighborhood. As word spread about Willowbrook Estates' transformation from an oppressive HOA nightmare into a model community, we began receiving visitors from other neighborhoods facing similar problems with corrupt or overly aggressive homeowner associate. 2 years after Marcus Henderson's arrest, I stood in my driveway on a perfect spring morning, watching my neighbors go about their daily routines in a community that had been completely transformed by the power of truth, justice, and collective action. My military truck, now properly recognized as the historical artifact and symbol of service it had always been, was scheduled to be featured in a documentary about HOA reform and veteran rights that would air on national television. The truck's combat scars, once mocked by Marcus as deterioration, were now highlighted in a bronze plaque installed by the community to honor not just my service, but the service of all military personnel who'd used similar vehicles to protect American lives in dangerous places around the world. The morning sun glinted off the truck's reinforced panels as children from the neighborhood gathered around for our weekly History and Heroes session, where I shared stories about courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right even when it seems impossible. These young people, who'd grown up during Marcus's reign of petty tyranny, were now learning that ordinary citizens have extraordinary power when they refuse to be intimidated by bullies and corruption. As I watched Thomas Wright walking his dog past houses where residents now flew American flags without fear of HOA retaliation, and Dr. Stevens tending to the community garden that had replaced Marcus's symbol of elitist exclusion, I reflected on how dramatically our little corner of suburbia had changed. The Willowbrook Estates had become a model community that other neighborhoods visited to learn about effective governance, conflict resolution, and the importance of protecting individual rights within collective organizations. Marcus Henderson, meanwhile, was serving his 12-year sentence at a federal minimum security prison in another state, spending his days working in the laundry facility and his evenings writing letters to various appeal courts that continued to reject his claims of innocence. His former mansion housed a family of 5 who'd turned the backyard into a playground and painted a mural on the garage door celebrating military service and community cooperation. The poetic justice was perfect. The man who tried to control every detail of other people's lives now had every moment of his own existence controlled by federal prison regulations. The story of our community's transformation had spread far beyond our neighborhood boundaries, inspiring similar reform movements in HOA communities across the country and leading to new state legislation protecting homeowner rights and requiring financial transparency in community associations. I testified before the state legislature about the importance of preventing HOA corruption, and my military truck had been displayed in the Capitol Rotunda as a symbol of the service and sacrifice that Marcus had tried to suppress. As I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck to drive to another speaking engagement about community activism and veteran rights, I smiled thinking about how Marcus had been absolutely right about one thing. My truck really had changed everything in Willowbrook Estates. He just hadn't understood that the change would be the complete destruction of his corrupt little empire and the birth of a genuinely free and caring community. Have you ever had an HOA nightmare that seemed impossible to overcome? Share your story in the comments below. And remember that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they stand up for truth and justice. Subscribe for more stories about communities fighting back against corruption and winning. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of misjudgment, underestimated value, and the powerful dignity of those with hidden skills. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of respecting others and to inspire a deeper appreciation for the quiet brilliance that can defy expectations.